A woman is weeping in Ramah. I've chosen this morning a text from 1 Samuel chapter 1. Anytime when we see a woman weeping, our hearts are moved. There's a domestic disturbance in Ramah, not the kind that the police are called to, but trouble in the house. And how sad it is whenever peace in the home is disturbed. You know, some people exist day to day, trapped in a miserable home life. You never know what your coworkers go home to. And that sheds some light, a little bit of light on why they act the way they do. Well, join me in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We'll start by reading the first 8 verses. There was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, that is, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. And when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Well, the Bible paints pictures in true colors. And here is Hannah's bitter sorrow. I mentioned a woman is weeping in Ramah. The first verse gives us Elkanah, her husband, his pedigree, his family tree, his ancestry. And we discover that he's a Levite, and that's backed up indisputably by 1 Chronicles 6, where it also gives his ancestry, and we discover that he's of the Kohathites, which was a branch of the Levites. And the Kohathites had the job of transporting the tabernacle and the altar and the Ark of the Covenant and all of the utensils. That was their job. Their families camped on the south side. They were south side campers of the tabernacle. There was no temple in those days, but a tent. And the Ark of the Covenant was contained in the Holy of Holies in the tent. And so they transported all of these things on poles carried on their shoulder. No one touched the articles to transport them, or they were killed. So this is Elkanah. And we're told that he has 2 wives, and that's where his troubles begin today. God's way is best. 2 wives is not God's way. And it's not a case in this instance where two are better than one, like it says in Ecclesiastes. And whenever we deviate from the revealed will of God, we're asking for trouble. The biblical ideal, when we deviate from that. And in a home life like Elkanah's, it meant misery. So this wretched practice of polygamy, it was so prevalent by then that it was considered normal, and it was culturally accepted, and it was even regulated by the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy 21, there are laws regarding favoritism and laws regarding the right of the firstborn. If you had a wife and she had children and one was the firstborn, but you didn't love that wife, you had another wife that you loved and her child was not the firstborn, you couldn't swap the role of firstborn. There were laws regulating that awkward situation. And so the conflict in the home centered around a rivalry between these two wives. One of the wives had children, the other one did not. So here is Hannah's sorrow and a negative providence. She was childless. And I say it's providence because it is the Lord, the Bible tells us, who opens and closes the womb, gives children and does not. Now, part of the sorrow involved in all of this is her total inability to do anything about it. She was completely helpless. She was a captive of the situation. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt totally helpless in a situation? Just a captive of it? Well, this was Hannah. She did have a positive providence. She had a loving husband. He provided everything necessary. He gave her a double portion. But this negative providence cast a cloud over everything. We're tempted in situations like this to have hard thoughts of God. It was God who gave children or not. And so Hannah would be tempted to think badly of God. Now, her sorrow was amplified by the taunts of her rival, flaunting her own fertility. Not accidentally insensitive. You know, you could say something by accident that would hurt someone's feelings if you were an insensitive person. That wasn't the case right here. It was obvious flaunting. And she was insufferably haughty, and she stated outwardly, without any reservation, her superiority. She had children, sons and daughters. But Hannah had none. And we little imagine how devastating these things are. Cruelty is a fact of fallen human nature. So here she is, verbally abused, emotionally abused. And we could, I suppose, in some ways, chalk up these differences to dispositional flaws or differences like that. Here's a strong-willed, domineering woman and maybe a weaker, more quiet personality, and the one dominates the other, but it was different than that. It was just cruelty. And it caused much discord and strife and clashes in the family. Do everything in your power to prevent strife in your home and maintain peace there. Now, we don't read that Hannah flaunted the love of her husband over Peninnah. She didn't turn around and say, yes, you have kids, but he loves me more. We're not told that in the text. So here she is, bitterly provoked and irritated beyond measure, And it's not a troublesome neighbor. It's not a difficult coworker. It's not someone within the church. It's someone in her own house. Can you imagine? I'm just kind of painting the picture here. It produced a deep heart sadness that even affected the normal patterns of her life. She wasn't eating. Maybe for you, a situation like this would mean sleepless nights. It has for me in the past, seemingly inescapable. That those thoughts of helplessness and those things that I was talking about, inability. And not only that, but it may very well be that the second wife was taken as a result of Hannah's infertility. When we can trace our griefs back to something that we ourselves did, it makes it all the more sharp, the pain. It was a long-standing sorrow. It says in verse 7, it happened year after year. That's hopelessness. Talk about feeling trapped. So here they are attending a festival. There were several festivals out of the year, the unleavened bread, Pentecost, the festival of booths, different ones. The priests went to Shiloh, offered sacrifices, and varying sacrifices of all different kinds. But the offering was a thank offering, and it was meant to be a celebration. We know that because portions were given to the family to eat of the sacrifice. And according to Deuteronomy 12:12, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates. It almost makes you cry thinking of it. Here's Hannah, no sons and daughters. But they're at a festival and commanded by God to rejoice in it and be thankful. Well, this is her sorrow. Elkanah apparently was patient with both of his wives. The haughty, provoking one, we don't read where he reproved her in any way. And the wounded, depressed one. He seems to have been patient with both of them. A little patience goes a long ways. Great patience is a great virtue. And here is her husband's well-meaning but awkward attempts to console her somehow, and they were ineffective. Here's what he says to her, and I'm paraphrasing. Don't be sad, Hannah. After all, you've got me. Well, at least he tried. A man that I read in this portion right here, Dale Ralph Davies, he said, Bible stories of barren women given children by God encourage us in our impossible situations. And it's so true because a survey of the Bible, who do we know that were barren couples? Well, let me see. There's Abraham and Sarah, beyond childbearing years, both of them. And Hagar was the fleshly workaround there in desperation. And through Hagar, Ishmael was produced, and a whole lot of jealousy. And there's the misery. And Sarah mistreated Hagar, treated her harshly, and eventually drove her away. You remember the story there. But God gave Isaac, miraculously, the child of the promise. They were beyond childbearing years. So Isaac, the child of the promise. Now, Isaac and Rebekah were childless. They were barren, you remember that? Isaac took a different approach. Genesis 25:21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And so the Lord gave Rebekah and Isaac Jacob. And who was Jacob? But he was the father of the 12 nations of Israel. You see the generosity of God here. So Jacob goes and marries Rachel. Lo and behold, Rachel was barren. Genesis 30 and verse 1, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister Leah, who had many children. And she said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Like it was his fault. Like he could do something about it. And Jacob said, his anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And so the rest of that story reads like a soap opera in Jacob's home. But the Lord eventually gave to Jacob and Rachel Joseph. And who was Joseph? He rose second in command to Pharaoh, delivered the land from famine, and went on as a type of Christ in the Old Testament. Then there's Manoah and his wife. The angel of the Lord came to them and announced the birth of Samson. And who was Samson but an utterly unique individual in the Bible that delivered the nation of Israel from the Philistines? And how about Zechariah and Elizabeth? They were barren beyond years, again, like Abraham and Sarah. And none other than the angel Gabriel was sent to them to announce the birth of who? John the Baptist. And what do we know about John the Baptist? He was the forerunner of Jesus, and Jesus said the greatest prophet the world has known. So here's just a handful of cases of barren couples in the Bible. So I agree with Dale Ralph Davies. Bible stories of barren women given children by God encourage us in our impossible situations. So her sorrow, well, now her appeal in verse 9. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. And she, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she made a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head." And now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, and only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." But Hannah answered and said, "No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I've poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I've spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." Then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." And so the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Well, here's her appeal. The festival was over. Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh, and she couldn't bear to go on like this for another year. So she's driven by desperation and exasperation to God, to call on God. And she did the right thing. She called on God. She went to church. She cried out to God. He alone was the one who could help. And her prayer burst forth from a heart that was greatly distressed. Has that ever, those two words ever described you? They have me. One of the things that's so captivating about this account right here, this narrative right here, is we can relate to it. I can. She was greatly distressed. Her prayer was punctuated with bitter weeping, it says. She was greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord, and wept bitterly. And she says of herself later on that she is oppressed in spirit and is speaking out of her great concern and provocation. Now, this prayer is amazing on several levels. One, it's amazing that Hannah assumed that God cared about her sorrow. That's kind of amazing to me. Here she is, she's no prophet. She's not a priest, she's not a king. All she is a relatively insignificant woman who's got this home issue going on that has become so grievous that it's distressed her and provoked her in her spirit to the place where she is under great concern and she can't take it anymore. And so she approaches God and she assumes that God cares. You know, God told Moses, the Lord told Moses in Exodus 3, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, and I am aware of their sufferings. Here's a nation in bondage, slavery in Egypt, and God was aware of that, but Hannah is just a woman. There may have been hundreds of thousands of those in bondage to Egypt, but here are the sorrows of one relatively insignificant woman. And I'm thankful that God is mindful of the individual as well as a nation. I mean, where would I be? Where would you be if you had to be somebody in order to get a hearing with God? And so as I'm going through all of this, if you may, I don't know, many of you, if you're in a situation that is desperate, God hears desperate prayers, individuals He cares about. David said in Psalm 6 and verse 6, I'm weary with my sighing, and every night I make my bed swim, and I dissolve my couch with my tears, and my eye has wasted away with grief. And then he went on to say, the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping. The first part is not amazing. That's the first part, the weeping and the grief, that's common human situation. But the second part is amazing. The Lord hears the voice of my weeping. And so here she prays, and the content was an appeal to God with a promise. She asked God three things. She asked God to notice, to remember, and to respond. That's, if you break her prayer down, it falls into those categories. She asks for his eye, his heart, and his hand. She says, look on the affliction of your maidservant. She's asking for his eye, asking him to notice. Then she says, remember me and don't forget me. She's asking for his heart to care. And then she says, give your maidservant a son. She's asking for him to act, his hand, to respond to her prayer. She not only asked for a child, but she asked for a son. And she not only asked for a son, but a Nazirite. She wanted a son who was consecrated to the Lord. Now that's a godly desire for parents, isn't it? It's one thing. She could have just said, give me a child. Doesn't matter to me as long as it's healthy. That's what we always say, isn't it? But she said, no, give me a son. And make it so that he knows you. He's consecrated to you. She wanted her son to serve God. Now, that was basically the content of her prayer. The content was private. It was an example of private prayer. She was speaking in her heart. Now, in a public prayer meeting, it should never be said about us, behold, the lips are moving, but the voice is not heard. If you're going to pray in a public meeting, lift your voice. Our brother Moses, I guarantee we had no problems hearing him. But whenever we put our head down, bury it in a chair or whatever, and we mumble, nobody is edified by that prayer. True, God knows the heart. But let it not be said about us, our lips are moving, but no voice is heard. She prayed. In this case, it was a private prayer. And I'm thankful that it's true, Psalm 139, you understand my thoughts from afar, and even before there's a word on my tongue, you know it. That's God. She was misunderstood in this situation. Here, the preacher got it wrong. You know, we're not infallible in our judgment. Eli thought she was drunk, and appearances aren't a good way to draw conclusions, are they? Only God looks on the heart. But here he reproves her. Sometimes a reproof is necessary, but he thought he was observing a glaring sin problem. Here's a woman in the temple, and she's overdone the alcohol. And she corrected that misunderstanding rather than letting it prevail. She could have hung her head and gone out sorrowful, reproved by the priest in the temple, and not gotten anywhere. But she didn't. She corrected it. She revealed the state of her heart without revealing the content of her prayer to Eli. She didn't tell him what she had prayed for, only what the state of her heart was during her prayer. So, talk to the preacher, because we can't see the heart. All we can do is draw conclusions by what we see from the outside. So here he enters in with her and helps with the blessing of his own. May God grant it, give grace to you. He put the amen to what she prayed, even though he didn't know the content of it. May God grant you the prayer that you asked for. It's grace he's asking for. That's what that word grant means right there. And so there is strength in numbers. If we can ask someone or have someone pray with us, join with us in praying, there's strength in that to break through. That's one of the reasons that public prayer meetings are so valuable and worthwhile. Prayers joined together. Well, faith breaks through here. There was a sense that she had come and done business with God, that God had heard her. Eli had put the amen to it. She continued there, we're told, she continued in praying until she was convinced that she was heard and had her prayer request granted. And then her demeanor changed. She ate, her face was no longer sad. Isn't that the way that it is? You meet with God and you have a real sense that God heard, that you broke through somehow. And your demeanor's changed. Your heart's lifted. Her heart was cheered. She was no longer sad. Bishop Hall said these words. He said, "It cannot be spoken how much ease and joy the hearts of people find in having unloaded their cares and poured out their supplications into the ears of God. The conscience may well rest when it tells us that we have neglected no means of addressing our affliction, for then it may resolve to look either for solution or for patience." Well, here's her joy, verse 19. We've seen her sorrow, we've seen her appeal. Here's her joy. Then they arose early in the morning, worshiped before the Lord, and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And it came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked him of the Lord." Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, "I will not go up until the child is weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever." And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Remain until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word." So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. So her joy is based on God's faithfulness. God heard her prayer, and he responded and granted her a son. And we read in verse 20, it was in due time. God's timing is always right. He can't be pressured into doing something. Oftentimes, his timing is part of the trial, perhaps. It's long-standing. But in due time, God answered. Someone said that wise disposer of all things knows it fit to hold us short of those favors we desire of him, whether for the trial of our patience or the exercise of our faith or the increase of our urgency. He's the wise disposer. Well, she conceived, delivered a healthy baby boy, named him after his father. No, she didn't. Named him after the priest that blessed her in the temple. No, she didn't. She named him after God, who answered her prayer. That's what the name Samuel means. It means the name of God. "The Lord has heard my supplication," David said. "The Lord receives my prayer." In another place, in another psalm, "But certainly God has heard. He's given heed to the voice of my prayer. Blessed be God, who's not turned away my prayer, nor his loving kindness from me." Well, she keeps her vow. And this is another amazing thing. It was a joy for her to keep her vow. Verse 24, "Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli." So apparently Elkanah was on board with this vow. I mean, she was giving up her son. He was giving up a son as well. You know, there were provisions in the law to have a vow annulled if upon hearing it, the husband was not in agreement with it. So he could have done something about that. You find that provision in Numbers 30. But Hannah returned, it seems like 3 years or so, the time that it takes to wean a baby in those days. She returned those years later to bring her only son, and he was an only son at that point in time. Keep that in mind as well. To Eli, who probably didn't even know the content of what her prayer was back at the time. Now, surprise, surprise, his life is going to change. I remember when Angela was born, a brand new baby. Virginia came to visit us. I don't know if you remember that or not. You came to visit us. She was just a newborn in the crib. And one thing that Virginia said to me that I'll never forget, she said, "Boy, Clint, your life is going to change." And it was very prophetic and profound, and it made my knees knock. But here's old man Eli, and this woman brings a baby, a little one, a toddler probably by then, 3 years old, and says, "Here, he's yours now. I hope you know how to change diapers." But she did it joyfully, and that's amazing to me as well. And she gave glory to God for his gracious provision and blessing. She says in verse 26, she said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he's dedicated to the Lord." And he, I believe Eli, worshiped the Lord there. Well, she gave glory to God. "For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him." We don't ever want to be unprofitable recipients of the grace of God by not giving him praise and glory. So we have her song of exaltation in the 2nd chapter, and I'm not going to read it for the purpose of time, but in that psalm of exaltation, she prays again at Shiloh. It's a prayer. It says, verse 1, Hannah prayed and said. And so it's a prayer, but it's a different prayer than the previous one. It's very joyful. Her heart is not overflowing with distress and sorrow, but rather now it's overflowing with joy and praise to God. And she says in verse 2 of that chapter, "There is no one holy like the Lord, and indeed there's no one beside you, nor is there any rock like our God." So she glorified God and returned Samuel to him. Now, the confirmation of Samuel, and we close with this thought. In chapter 2, look at verse 11. "Elkanah went to his home in Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest." Can you imagine how hard that would have been? A little 3-year-old, and you leave him there with someone to take care of him that he doesn't know. How difficult that would be for a mother and a father for that to happen. The same chapter, verse 18, "Now Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod." I don't know how all that works. Here's a boy and he's wearing the garments of a priest, a ministering priest. "And his mother," verse 19, it's full of feeling, "and his mother would make him a little robe and bring it to him from year to year when she would come up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice." I can't imagine it. "Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, 'May the Lord give you children from this woman in place of the one she dedicated to the Lord.' And they went to their own home, and the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord." Verse 26, "Now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor with both the Lord and with men." So here Hannah receives grace upon grace. It's just like God to do that. She dedicated 1 son. She got 3 and 2 daughters thrown in as well. And we read in chapter 3, verse 1, the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and visions were infrequent. Verse 10, then the Lord came and stood as at other times and spoke, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. The Lord was with him. He was a chosen vessel of the Lord. Verse 19, Samuel grew and the Lord was with him and let none of his words fail. The Lord was with him. It was said of Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. It was said of Jacob, behold, I am with you, God said, and will keep you wherever you go. It was recounted of Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. Of Samson, it was said, the child grew up, the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. Of John the Baptist, the child continued to grow and became strong in spirit. All of those were the results of barren women and God's mercies. And we're told that the Lord was with him and let none of his words fail. And chapter 4 starts, thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord again appeared in Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. That's quite a story. It's said in chapter 9 and verse 6, someone said, behold, now there is a man of God in this city. And the man is held in honor, and all that he says surely comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us about our journey on which we have set out for. That was Samuel. Behold, there's a man of God in this city. So here he was, the last of the judges. He anointed and installed King David, who was a man after God's own heart. He was a praying man of God, a great intercessor. Even the psalm writers speak. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those that called on his name. And even God said to Jeremiah, even though Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, my heart would not be with this people. So that was Samuel, the confirmation of Samuel, and the account of Hannah. God hears desperate prayers. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. And in her song she said, he keeps the feet of his godly ones, for not by might shall a man prevail. Well, may our hearts be encouraged by this narrative right here. And may we find a way to apply the things that God has preserved out of this account for us.